While preparing for the release of the Dead Space remake, I immersed myself in all of the media the franchise had to offer. Not only that, I watched a number of story and lore retrospectives to make sure I had a full understanding of the world before diving back into it. It was during my time listening to these videos and combing through the comments that I realized many people don't seem to understand exactly how the Necromorphs are made. The general consensus is that the Necromorphs are created by the marker signal, but this is only partially true. The origin of Necromorphs is surprisingly much more man-made than you would initially think. And in this video, we're going to take a look at how each outbreak started, going all the way back to the beginning of the Dead Space timeline. In the book Dead Space Martyr, we're introduced to the Black Marker, the first of its kind as far as humanity is aware. It's found underwater beneath the Chicxulub crater, and we see our first examples of early Necromorph life on the beaches by the crater. Fleshy mounds are found by the locals, some large, some small. Upon their first interaction with them, the local Brujah shows them that there's parts of these masses that are shining yellow, weak spots they can attack to put an end to these abominations. It's implied that the locals continue this practice and remove whatever necrotic flesh they encounter. Unfortunately, the scientists studying the marker also learn about this flesh, including Michael Altman, who recovers a sample and brings it to their research facility. After Altman escapes the facility, his sample's recovered, and the researchers still doing their work try to learn what they can from it. A German scientist named Grote Guth, who was working on discovering the secrets of the genetic code within the flesh, begins seeing visions of his grandmother, telling him to stop at once and leave the marker alone. In an attempt to sedate himself and stop the visions, he accidentally injects a serum made from the necrotic flesh directly into his bloodstream. This is the beginning of the first Necromorph outbreak. While he does manage to get to the marker in time to stop the transformation process, he's killed for breaking into its secure location, and as his dead body is wheeled away from the marker, he becomes the very first infector. The most interesting thing about this is that, before this point, the signal being broadcast by the marker has not been turning the dead into necromorphs. Many in the facility had been driven to suicide or homicidal rage due to the effects of the marker, but none underwent this kind of necromorph transformation. It wasn't until a human researcher was manipulated into injecting himself with the necrotic flesh created by the marker that it was possible for an infector to be created. After this, the infector murdered and reanimated numerous people through the facility, and humanity encountered its first necromorph outbreak. From this point on, the marker seems to be able to create necromorphs without the aid of humanity. However, we do have a theory surrounding this. The markers encountered after Dead Space Martyr are all man-made, created using blueprints written by Michael Altman. When Altman came in direct contact with the marker, he was shown how to create more markers. We believe these blueprints included the ability for the new marker signal to create infectors. This would explain why the black marker doesn't seem to be able to do this on its own, while the red marker has no issue creating infectors from the dead. The black marker learned the genetic makeup of the necromorphs due to the actions of Grote, and incorporated this new evolution for humanity in the plans for future markers. In this way, the markers are able to create a path toward achieving their goal of convergence. The next noteworthy infection we'd want to discuss is the outbreak aboard the USG Ishimura. While the original Dead Space doesn't provide too much detail into how the outbreak started, the movie Dead Space Downfall shows us how the Necromorphs reached the ship in the first place. During the Ishimura's planet-cracking mission to Aegis 7, the crew discovers the red marker, and is ordered to bring it on board the ship. You would think that this is where the infection begins, but no. After bringing the marker on board, they continued with their planet-cracking expedition, and pulled up a chunk of planet to be mined. In doing so, a power outage struck the colony below, and a couple of miners were sent to investigate. Colin Barrow immediately went to check on his wife, who was living in the colony, and upon finding her, he sees that she's covered in symbols, and she commits suicide before his eyes, telling him, "They want our bodies." Colin then frantically brings his wife's corpse back to his shuttle, where an infector manages to sneak in before taking off. The infector turns Colin's wife into a necromorph, and after they board the Ishimura, the infection begins to spread. In this case, we see that the red marker was able to create an infector without the influence of scientists or humanity as a whole.
We can see the events of the fall of the Aegis 7 colony in the Dead Space comic books and Dead Space Extraction. Long story short, a mass unitologist suicide created enough necrotic flesh for the red marker to create infectors and bring the colony to its knees.
After the events of Dead Space, we see another outbreak aboard the USG O'Bannon in Dead Space Aftermath. The O'Bannon was sent to Aegis 7 in order to search for leftover pieces of the red marker, and unfortunately for the crew, they found one. Upon bringing it back to the ship, Nolan Strauss begins studying the artifact. In doing so, he sees the language of the marker and seems to understand it in a way others can't. He becomes obsessed with his research and begins experimenting on the dead currently filling the sickbay. In doing so, Strauss creates a necromorph, and the marker tricks him into releasing it. This begins the infection aboard the O'Bannon, that would eventually lead to Strauss finding his way aboard the Sprawl. So we've established that the red marker did have the ability to create infector necromorphs, but it would seem that a fragment of the marker doesn't put out a strong enough signal to do this on its own. The marker again needed the help of a human scientist to push its agenda by manipulating Strauss into boosting the signal and reanimating its undead army. This brings us to Dead Space 2, where there seems to be some misunderstandings about how the necromorph infection spread through the Sprawl. While the USG Ishimura was docked at the Sprawl for over a year, it actually had nothing to do with the necromorphs we encounter there. The undead tissue left behind on the Ishimura had no part in infecting those who lived on the Sprawl. The hive mind the necromorphs operate under is linked to the specific marker that's responsible for creating them. So upon the destruction of the red marker, these necromorphs were left as nothing but undead goo. The true culprit of this particular outbreak is the Titan marker. In the events of the Dead Space mobile game, our protagonist, Vandal, is manipulated into releasing access to the mines underneath the Titan colony, where a new necromorph outbreak had begun. We can assume through the information gathered from the various unitologist logs in Dead Space 2 that they were fully aware of the connection between necromorphs and the marker. These unitologists consider necromorphs to be the next step in their evolution, and the path through which they can all converge and become one. With this in mind, it seems likely that unitologists were responsible for the outbreak in the mines, possibly even sacrificing themselves so the marker could turn them into infectors and spread the infection across the mines before they were locked down. We believe these are the best examples of necromorph outbreaks throughout the series, as they give us the most context behind how necromorphs are made. While we can say the marker is responsible for the creation of these monsters, it wouldn't have been possible without the human race. The marker manipulated a human scientist into turning himself into an undead abomination, and from there, manipulated another into creating more markers that had the ability to do this for themselves. The marker knows the best way to proliferate its necrotic army, and after the red markers are created with the ability to create necromorphs without direct human interaction, it seems to only create infectors. This way, the infectors can go on to create the necromorphs we see throughout the Dead Space series. Thanks for joining us for this breakdown of how necromorphs are created throughout Dead Space. Do you have any thoughts or additional details that would help flesh out these ideas? Should we treat the story of Dead Space Martyr as absolute canon? Or do you think the marker being able to create infectors was always intended? Like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you want us to keep diving into the lore of Dead Space. From the team at SGG, thanks again, and we'll see you next time.